At the engagement dinner, my son-in-law raised his glass and said, "A toast to real men. There are so few providers in this world." And he looked at me. The whole family laughed. I smiled, adjusted my leather jacket, and revealed who owned the house. In that moment, "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." The chandelier above the dining room table cast warm light over what should have been a celebration, but all I could feel was the familiar knot forming in my stomach. I sat at the far end of the mahogany table, the same spot I'd occupied for the past 10 years whenever these family gatherings occurred, the spot reserved for the family disappointment. My daughter Sarah glowed in her engagement dress, a soft blue that brought out her eyes. She looked radiant, genuinely happy, and for a moment I forgot about everything else. This was her night. After everything that had happened between her mother and me, after all the ways this family had fractured, Sarah deserved this moment of pure joy. Marcus, her fiancé, stood up suddenly, his wine glass catching the light. He was a tall man, confident in the way that comes from never having been truly tested by life. At 32, he had the kind of easy success that made him believe he was entitled to it. His real estate business was booming. His BMW sat in the driveway next to my 15-year-old Honda, and he never let anyone forget the difference. "I'd like to make a toast," Marcus announced, his voice carrying that familiar edge of superiority I'd come to recognize over the past year. The table fell silent. My ex-wife Linda looked up at him with obvious approval, her perfectly styled hair not moving despite the evening breeze from the open French doors. My younger daughter Jessica set down her phone, which was rare enough to signal this was important. "To my beautiful bride-to-be," Marcus began, raising his glass toward Sarah. She beamed back at him, her hand instinctively reaching for mine across the table. I squeezed it gently, feeling the delicate engagement ring I'd somehow helped pay for, though nobody at this table knew that part of the story. But Marcus wasn't finished. He turned his gaze around the table, landing on each family member before his eyes settled on me. There was something calculating in his expression, something that made my chest tighten with a familiar dread. "And let's have a toast to real men," he continued, his voice growing louder. "To the providers, the protectors, the ones who step up when it matters. Because let's face it, there aren't many left in this world." His eyes locked with mine as he delivered the final blow. Real men who can actually take care of their families. The silence that followed felt like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. Then Linda started laughing, a sharp sound that cut through the air like glass breaking. Jessica joined in with an uncomfortable giggle, and even Sarah, my sweet Sarah, let out a nervous laugh while shooting apologetic glances in my direction. I felt my face burn with shame and anger, but I did what I always did. I smiled. I lifted my own glass of water, since I'd stopped drinking wine years ago when money was tighter, and I nodded as if Marcus had just paid me a compliment instead of delivering a public humiliation. "Cheers," I said quietly, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside my chest. I adjusted my leather jacket, the same one I'd worn for the past 8 years, and took a sip of water while everyone else drank wine that cost more per bottle than I used to spend on groceries in a week. Marcus settled back into his chair with a satisfied smirk, clearly pleased with himself. He reached over and squeezed Sarah's hand, and I watched my daughter's face light up again as the moment passed. She was so in love, so hopeful about her future. She had no idea that her fiancé had just delivered a carefully calculated insult designed to remind everyone at the table of my failures. The conversation resumed around me, flowing over topics I couldn't afford to participate in. Linda was discussing her upcoming kitchen renovation, the one she'd been planning for months. Jessica was talking about her graduate program at Northwestern, the tuition for which seemed to magically get paid, despite Linda's constant complaints about money being tight. Marcus was describing his latest real estate deals, each one more impressive than the last. I sat there in my worn leather jacket, feeling invisible and unwanted, just like I had for the past 10 years. Ever since the divorce, ever since I'd lost everything, ever since I'd become the cautionary tale this family liked to tell themselves about what happens when a man doesn't live up to expectations. What they didn't know, what none of them could have possibly imagined as they sat in that beautiful dining room laughing at Marcus's joke about real men, was that I owned every single thing they were touching. The mahogany table where we sat, the crystal glasses they drank from, the roof over their heads, the very chairs that supported them as they mocked my inability to provide. But I wasn't ready to tell them that yet. Not tonight. Tonight, I would smile and play my role as the family failure one more time. Tomorrow, everything would change. As Marcus launched into another story about his success, I caught my reflection in the window. 58 years old, graying hair, lines around my eyes that spoke of too many nights working too many jobs. I looked exactly like what they thought I was, a man who had given up, who had accepted his place at the bottom of the family hierarchy. If only they knew the truth. The drive home from Sarah's engagement dinner took me through the old neighborhood where Linda and I used to live together, before everything fell apart. I hadn't meant to take this route, but my hands seemed to steer the Honda down familiar streets without conscious thought. Maybe I needed to remember how it all began, how I'd ended up sitting at that table tonight being treated like a charity case by my own family. 10 years ago, when Linda filed for divorce, she'd been ruthless in a way that still took my breath away. I'd come home from my job at the automotive plant to find legal papers spread across our kitchen table and a woman I barely recognized sitting across from them. 22 years of marriage reduced to asset division and custody arrangements. "You never grew up, Frank," she'd said that night, her voice cold and clinical. "You're still the same dreamer you were in college, thinking everything will just work out if you try hard enough. But trying isn't enough anymore. Sarah and Jessica need stability, not empty promises. The house," she'd argued, "should go to her. She was the one with the steady job at the bank, the reliable income, the practical mindset that our daughters needed. I was just a factory worker with a high school diploma and what she called unrealistic expectations about life." The judge had agreed. Linda got the house, I got the debt, and our daughters got a clear message about which parent had failed them. What Linda didn't know was that losing everything had been the best thing that ever happened to me. I'd moved into a one-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Henderson's garage, the kind of place that smelled like motor oil and had water stains on the ceiling. It wasn't much, but it was mine. And for the first time in years, I could think clearly. Without Linda's constant criticism echoing in my ears, without the pressure of maintaining a lifestyle we couldn't afford, I started to see possibilities instead of problems. The severance package from the plant closure had been more generous than anyone expected, $87,000. Most of my co-workers had used theirs to buy new trucks or take vacations, treating it like found money. But I'd seen it differently. I'd seen it as a chance to start over, to prove that Linda had been wrong about me all along. I'd spent months studying, reading every book I could find about real estate investment, property management, market analysis. While Linda was redecorating the house with money from her salary, I was learning how to make money work for me instead of the other way around. I bought my first rental property 6 months after the divorce, a small duplex in a working-class neighborhood that needed more love than most investors were willing to give. The irony wasn't lost on me. Linda had called me a dreamer, but she was the one living in a fantasy where steady paychecks were enough to build real wealth. I was the one who understood that security came from owning assets, not from depending on employers who could disappear overnight. Over the next 3 years, I'd acquired 7 more properties. Nothing fancy. Nothing that would draw attention. Small apartment buildings, modest family homes, a few commercial spaces that needed renovation. I did most of the work myself, learning plumbing and electrical and carpentry from YouTube videos and trial and error. My hands were always dirty, my back always ached, but my bank account was growing in ways that would have shocked anyone who knew me. The real breakthrough came when the Riverside Commons development went up for sale. It was a small shopping complex with a dozen storefronts, half of them empty, owned by an elderly man who was tired of dealing with tenants and maintenance requests. The asking price was $400,000, more money than I'd ever imagined having, but I'd learned enough by then to see the potential. The location was perfect, right in the path of the city's expansion, close enough to downtown to attract businesses but far enough out to keep overhead costs reasonable. I'd convinced the bank to give me a commercial loan, using my other properties as collateral, and bought the entire complex for $360,000. Within 18 months, I'd filled every storefront and raised the rents by 30%. The monthly income from Riverside Commons alone was more than I'd made in a year at the automotive plant. But I didn't tell anyone. I didn't drive a fancy car or move to a better neighborhood. I kept living in Mrs. Henderson's garage apartment, kept wearing the same clothes, kept playing the role of the divorced dad who couldn't quite get his life together. Because I'd learned something important during those early years of rebuilding. People's perception of you could be a powerful tool if you knew how to use it. Linda saw a failure, so she never asked questions about my finances. My daughters saw a struggling father, so they never wondered why I could always help with unexpected expenses. The whole family saw exactly what they expected to see, a man who had been defeated by life and was too proud to admit it. But every month, I'd been quietly purchasing more properties, expanding my portfolio, building something that would have impressed even Linda if she'd bothered to pay attention. By year 5, I owned 43 rental units across 3 different neighborhoods. By year 7, I'd bought a small office building downtown and converted the upper floors into luxury apartments. And then, 3 years ago, I'd made the purchase that changed everything. Linda had been complaining about her landlord for months. The man who owned her house, she'd told Sarah during one of their weekly coffee dates, was completely unresponsive to maintenance requests. The rent kept going up, but nothing ever got fixed properly. She was thinking about moving, but the housing market was so competitive, and she'd grown attached to the neighborhood where she'd raised the girls. When I'd seen the estate sale listing for a 5-bedroom colonial at 123 Maple Street, I'd recognized the address immediately. It was Linda's house, the house where my daughters had grown up, where I'd coached Sarah through her first heartbreak and helped Jessica with her college applications during my weekend visits. The elderly landlord had died, and his children wanted nothing to do with property management. They were asking $280,000 for a house that was worth at least $400,000 if someone was willing to put in the work to bring it up to code. I'd bought it that same week, paid cash, and signed the deed as Franklin Holdings LLC, the property management company I'd established years earlier. Then I'd hired a local management firm to handle the day-to-day interactions with tenants, including the woman in Unit A who had no idea her ex-husband was now her landlord. For 3 years, Linda had been paying rent to me every month. For 3 years, I'd been the mysterious property owner who approved her maintenance requests and kept her rent increases modest. For 3 years, I'd been taking care of the house where my daughters visited their mother, making sure it was safe and comfortable, while being treated like a deadbeat who couldn't even take care of himself. Tonight, sitting in that dining room while Marcus made his toast about real men and providers, I'd felt something shift inside me. The weight I'd been carrying for 10 years, the burden of being misunderstood and underestimated, suddenly felt unbearable. Maybe it was time they learned the truth about who I really was. The morning after Sarah's engagement dinner, I sat in my truck outside 123 Maple Street, watching Linda water the roses I had planted along the front walkway 2 summers ago. She had no idea that every bloom in that garden existed because I'd approved the landscaping budget, that every sprinkler head and every bag of mulch had been purchased with my money. Through the living room window, I could see the new curtains she'd hung last month. She'd called the property management company 3 times to get approval for the installation, worried that drilling holes in the window frames might violate her lease agreement. I'd instructed them to approve it immediately, and even authorized a $50 credit toward the hardware costs. Linda had been so pleased when they called her back, telling Sarah how surprisingly reasonable her landlord was becoming, if she only knew. The decision to buy this house hadn't been purely financial, though the investment made perfect sense. Properties in this neighborhood had been appreciating steadily, and Linda's lease payments more than covered the mortgage I could have taken if I'd needed one. But the real reason I'd purchased it was sitting right there in the driveway. Jessica's car, the reliable Honda Civic I'd helped her buy for college, parked next to Linda's sedan. After the divorce, I'd watched my daughters struggle with the instability. Not financial instability. Linda was right about having a steady income, but emotional instability. They'd grown up in this house, had friends in this neighborhood, felt rooted here in ways that only children can understand. When Linda had started talking about moving, about finding somewhere cheaper or more convenient to her job, I'd seen the worry in Sarah's eyes during our awkward Saturday lunches. "I just don't want Mom to have to stress about money," Sarah had confided in me during one of those meals, her voice small in the way it used to get when she was a little girl worried about thunderstorms. "She works so hard and the rent keeps going up. I keep thinking maybe I should move back home after graduation, help her with expenses." That conversation had haunted me for weeks. Sarah was 24 then, just starting her career, supposed to be thinking about her own future instead of worrying about her mother's finances. The idea that she might sacrifice her independence to help Linda pay rent on a house that I could easily afford to maintain was unbearable, so I'd made sure Linda never had to worry about losing this place. When the property management company raised her rent the first year, I'd instructed them to keep the increase minimal, just enough to match the market rate without causing hardship. When the heating system needed replacement the following winter, I'd absorbed the $7,000 cost without passing any of it along to her. When she'd requested permission to renovate the kitchen last spring, I'd not only approved it but authorized an additional $3,000 in improvements that she didn't even know about. Linda thought she was living in a rental property owned by some faceless corporation that happened to be unusually accommodating. In reality, she was living in a house I'd been carefully maintaining and improving specifically for her comfort and my daughter's peace of mind. The irony was so thick I could taste it every time she complained about her housing costs during family gatherings, while I sat there in my second-hand clothes being treated like the family failure. But the house was only part of the secret I'd been keeping. 3 months ago, Marcus had started talking about his plans to propose to Sarah. He'd cornered me after Jessica's birthday dinner, his voice full of the condescending tone he used whenever he felt obligated to include me in family discussions. "Frank, I want to do this right," he'd said, adjusting his expensive watch with the kind of gesture that was meant to be casual, but came across as calculated. "Sarah deserves the perfect proposal, the perfect ring, the perfect wedding. I'm planning something special." He'd gone on to describe his vision: a weekend trip to Napa Valley, dinner at a 5-star restaurant, a custom-designed engagement ring that would cost him 3 months' salary. The problem, he'd admitted with obvious reluctance, was that his real estate commissions had been unpredictable lately, and he didn't want to go into debt for the ring Sarah deserved. "I'm not asking for a handout," he'd been quick to clarify, though we both knew that was exactly what he was doing. "Just maybe a short-term loan. Family helping family, you know. I'll pay you back as soon as my next big sale closes." I'd sat there listening to him talk about family helping family, about Sarah deserving the best, about his temporary cash flow problems, and I'd felt that familiar mix of anger and sadness that had defined so much of my relationship with this family since the divorce. Here was a man who had just spent the evening making subtle digs about my inability to provide for my family, now asking me for money to buy my daughter an engagement ring. The smart thing, the self-preserving thing, would have been to say no. To explain that I was living paycheck to paycheck myself, that I couldn't afford to loan anyone 3 months' worth of anything. Marcus would have understood, would have found another way to finance the ring, and would have continued treating me like the family disappointment without the added sting of knowing I'd refused to help make his proposal perfect. Instead, I'd told him I'd think about it. 2 days later, I'd called him with an answer. Yes, I could help with the ring, but I had some conditions. First, this would be a gift, not a loan. I didn't want my daughter's engagement ring to come with the stress of debt hanging over their relationship. Second, the money would come through a jewelry store credit that I'd arranged directly with the dealer, so Marcus wouldn't have to worry about handling cash or checks. Third, and most importantly, Sarah was never to know where the money had come from. "I don't want her thinking about finances when she should be thinking about happiness," I'd told him, which was true enough. What I didn't say was that I couldn't bear the thought of my daughter knowing that her father had paid for her engagement ring, while her fiancé publicly mocked his ability to provide for his family. Marcus had been effusively grateful, promising that he'd never forget this kindness, swearing that he'd find a way to pay me back, even though I'd insisted it was a gift. He'd shaken my hand with tears in his eyes, calling me a true father, and a real man in a way that had made my chest ache with the irony of it all. The ring had cost $8,400. I'd paid for it with money from a single month's rental income from just 3 of my properties. For Marcus, it represented months of saving and sacrifice. For me, it was barely a noticeable expense. But I'd let him believe that I was stretching myself financially to help him, because that story was easier than the truth. Now, sitting in my truck watching Linda tend to flowers I'd paid for, I thought about all the ways I'd been taking care of this family without them knowing. Sarah's student loan payments, which had mysteriously been reduced through a financial hardship program that I'd arranged with the bank. Jessica's car insurance, which had been covered by an alumni assistance fund that existed only in the paperwork I'd created. Linda's medical bills from her surgery 2 years ago, which had been partially forgiven through a charitable foundation that was really just my checkbook with a different name. For 10 years, I'd been the invisible hand making their lives easier, smoother, more secure than they had any right to expect. And for 10 years, they'd treated me like a cautionary tale about what happened when a man couldn't measure up to his responsibilities. The weight of keeping these secrets was crushing me, but breaking them would be even worse. How could I tell Sarah that her engagement ring was a gift from the father she pitied? How could I explain to Linda that she'd been living in my house, that every comfort she enjoyed was subsidized by the man she'd divorced for being unreliable? How could I look at Jessica and admit that her college experience had been smooth because I'd been quietly removing obstacles she didn't even know existed? They loved the version of me that needed their pity more than they'd ever loved the version that could actually help them. And that realization was more painful than any of Marcus's carefully crafted insults. But after last night, after sitting through another evening of being treated like the family charity case while surrounded by things I'd paid for, I was starting to think that some truths were worth the pain of telling them. The call came at 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Sarah's engagement dinner. I was having coffee in my kitchen, reading through rental reports and trying to decide whether to approve a tenant's request for new carpeting, when my phone buzzed with Linda's number. She rarely called me directly anymore, preferring to communicate through the girls when necessary, so I knew something was wrong. "Frank, we need to talk." Her voice was tight with a familiar strain that took me back 20 years to fights about mortgage payments and credit card bills. "Can you meet me for lunch today? It's about the girls." My stomach dropped. In my experience, conversations that started with "it's about the girls" usually ended with me being asked to solve a problem I wasn't supposed to have the resources to handle. But I agreed to meet her at the diner downtown, the same place where we'd had our last real conversation before the lawyers took over our communication. Linda was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup, like she was trying to warm herself against some internal chill. She looked older than she had at the engagement dinner, tired in a way that makeup couldn't hide. When she looked up and saw me approaching, I caught something in her expression that I hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. "Thank you for coming," she said as I slid into the seat across from her. "I wasn't sure you would." I ordered coffee from the waitress and waited for Linda to explain why we were here. She spent a long moment staring out the window at the parking lot, organizing her thoughts in that precise way she'd always approached difficult conversations. "Marcus lost his job," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sarah doesn't know yet. He's been pretending to go to work for the past 3 days while he tries to figure out how to tell her." The news hit me like a physical blow. Marcus, with all his swagger about being a real provider, was unemployed and lying to my daughter about it. I thought about his toast from the week before, about his certainty that he represented everything I wasn't, and felt a surge of anger so sharp it surprised me. "What happened?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral despite the storm building in my chest. Linda's fingers tightened around her coffee cup. "Budget cuts at the dealership. They laid off half the sales staff, kept only the ones with the highest numbers. Marcus had been struggling for months, apparently. His commissions were way down from last year. This explained his cash flow problems when he'd asked me for help with the engagement ring. What he'd presented as a temporary inconvenience had actually been the beginning of serious financial trouble. The irony was brutal. He'd borrowed money from the man he'd publicly humiliated to buy a ring for a woman whose father was about to become his only source of support. "Sarah's going to be devastated," Linda continued. "She's been planning this wedding, talking about their future, and now Marcus doesn't even know if he'll be able to contribute to the expenses. He's too proud to tell her the truth, too scared of what she'll think of him." I understood that fear better than Linda could possibly know. The terror of being seen as inadequate by the people you loved most, the shame of not being able to provide in the ways that society expected, the crushing weight of feeling like you'd failed at the most basic requirements of manhood. Marcus was about to learn lessons I'd been living with for 10 years. "What does this have to do with me?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Linda looked at me directly for the first time since I'd sat down. "They're going to need help, Frank. Real help. The wedding alone is going to cost $15,000, and that's with Sarah doing half the work herself. Marcus can't afford his share right now, and Sarah's salary from the bank barely covers her own expenses." There it was. After a decade of being treated like the family's cautionary tale, I was being asked to rescue the golden couple from their financial crisis. The same man who had toasted to real providers just 7 days ago was now depending on the provider he'd mocked to save his engagement. "I can't cover a $15,000 wedding, Linda," I said, which was technically true. I could have covered it easily, could have paid for the entire event with money I'd make in 2 months, but Frank the failure wasn't supposed to have that kind of resources. "I'm not asking you to pay for everything," Linda said quickly, "but maybe you could help with some of the smaller expenses. The flowers, the photography, something that would take pressure off them without making it obvious that Marcus is struggling. I sat there staring at my ex-wife, this woman who had divorced me for being financially unreliable, now asking me to subsidize her daughter's wedding to a man who had publicly questioned my ability to provide for my family. The situation was so absurd it would have been funny if it weren't so painful. "I'll think about it," I said, the same response I'd given Marcus when he'd asked for help with the ring. But as I drove home from the diner, I realized that thinking wasn't what I needed to do anymore. For 10 years I'd been playing a role that was killing me slowly, pretending to be less than I was so that my family could feel comfortable with their perception of me. I'd been the invisible provider, the secret benefactor, the man who took care of everyone while being treated like he couldn't take care of himself. Marcus's unemployment had created a crisis, but it had also created an opportunity. For the first time since the divorce, my family needed something from me that couldn't be hidden or disguised as luck or charity. They needed real money, substantial money, the kind of money that would require them to acknowledge where it was coming from. That evening, I sat in my small apartment with the property deeds spread across my kitchen table, 47 rental units, 3 commercial buildings, 2 undeveloped lots that I was holding for future appreciation. On paper, I was worth just over $2 million, not counting the cash I had sitting in various investment accounts. I owned more real estate than anyone else in my family knew existed, generated more monthly income than Linda made in a year at the bank, and tomorrow, I could solve Marcus and Sarah's financial problems with a single phone call to my accountant. But first, I needed to decide what solving their problems would cost me. Not financially, that part was easy. The real cost would be ending the fiction that had defined my relationship with my family for the past decade. Once they knew what I was really worth, once they understood that I'd been taking care of them all along, everything would change. Sarah would have to face the fact that she'd spent years pitying a father who was more successful than her fiancé. Linda would have to acknowledge that the man she'd divorced for being unreliable had actually been supporting her lifestyle for the past 3 years. Jessica would have to reconsider every assumption she'd made about why our family had fallen apart, and Marcus would have to live with the knowledge that his future father-in-law, the man he'd publicly dismissed as a failure, was the only reason he'd be able to afford his own wedding. I picked up the deed to 123 Maple Street, Linda's house, my house, and studied the signatures and legal stamps that proved my ownership. In the morning, I could drive over there and knock on the door and hand this document to my ex-wife, along with explanations for every mysterious piece of good fortune she'd experienced over the past 3 years. Or I could keep playing my role, keep being the family disappointment who somehow always managed to help out in small ways, keep letting them think they were tolerating me out of obligation rather than benefiting from my generosity. But as I sat there in the apartment I'd chosen to live in despite being able to afford much better, surrounded by documents that proved I'd been lying to my family for a decade, I realized that the choice had already been made for me. Marcus's toast had been the last straw, but it wasn't really about Marcus. It was about 10 years of watching people I loved misunderstand everything about who I was and what I was capable of. It was about being grateful for crumbs at tables I'd paid to set. It was about playing a character that had become so convincing that even I sometimes forgot it was just an act. Tomorrow I would drive to 123 Maple Street with more than just solutions to their financial problems. I would bring the truth, all of it, and finally discover whether my family loved Frank the failure or whether they were capable of loving Frank the success. I chose Thursday evening, exactly 2 weeks after Sarah's engagement dinner. I called ahead and asked Linda if the whole family could gather for what I described as an important discussion about Sarah's wedding expenses. My voice must have carried something different that night because Linda didn't ask her usual probing questions or make her customary comments about hoping I wasn't about to disappoint everyone again. When I arrived at 123 Maple Street, my house, I parked in the same spot I'd used for 10 years of awkward family visits. But this time, I carried a leather portfolio instead of just the obligatory bottle of wine or box of pastries I usually brought as my contribution to family gatherings. Sarah answered the door, her face bright with hope that made my chest ache. She'd been struggling with the wedding costs. I could see it in the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes, in the careful way she'd been talking about simplifying her plans whenever anyone asked about the preparations. "Dad, thank you for coming," she said, reaching up to hug me. "Mom said you wanted to talk about helping with the wedding. I know money's tight for everyone right now, so whatever you can do, we're grateful." Whatever I can do. If she only knew. The living room looked exactly the same as it had during my marriage to Linda, except for the new furniture I'd secretly approved through the property management company 6 months ago. Marcus was already there, sitting in my favorite armchair, the one I'd picked out 23 years ago when Sarah was just learning to walk. He stood up when I entered, his handshake firm but his eyes avoiding mine. He'd been different since losing his job, quieter, less sure of himself. Linda emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of coffee and cookies, playing hostess in a house she didn't know belonged to me. Jessica looked up from her laptop long enough to wave before returning to whatever graduate school project had captured her attention. "Frank, sit down," Linda said, gesturing toward the couch. "Sarah and Marcus have been going over the wedding budget, and there are some areas where they could use support." I remained standing, the portfolio heavy in my hands. "Before we talk about the wedding, there's something I need to tell all of you. Something I should have said years ago." The room grew quiet. Sarah set down her coffee cup. Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and Linda gave me that familiar look of patient resignation she'd perfected during our marriage. The one that said she was prepared to be disappointed but would try to hide it for the sake of family harmony. 10 years ago, when Linda and I divorced, you all decided that I was the failure in this family," I began, my voice steady despite the pounding of my heart. "The man who couldn't provide, couldn't be counted on, couldn't measure up to what a husband and father should be." "Dad, that's not—" Sarah started, but I held up my hand. "Let me finish. For 10 years, I've sat at this table being treated like a charity case, like someone you tolerate out of obligation. Last week, Marcus made a toast about real men, about providers, while looking directly at me, and you all laughed." Marcus's face went red. "Frank, I didn't mean—" "You meant exactly what you said," I cut him off. "And you were right, there aren't many real providers left in this world, but you were wrong about which one I am." I opened the portfolio and pulled out the first document, the deed to 123 Maple Street. I placed it on the coffee table in front of Linda, the legal papers spread out so everyone could see the property description, the purchase date, and most importantly, the owner's name, Franklin Holdings, LLC. "This house belongs to me," I said into the stunned silence. "I bought it 3 years ago when your landlord died. Every month, Linda, when you pay your rent, you're paying me. Every repair request you've made, every improvement you've asked for, I'm the one who approved it." Linda's face went white as she picked up the deed, her hands shaking as she read the details. "This isn't possible," she whispered. I pulled out more documents, rental agreements for my other properties, bank statements showing monthly income that exceeded her annual salary, investment portfolios worth more than she'd made in her entire career at the bank. "I own 47 rental properties in this city," I continued, my voice growing stronger with each revelation. 3 commercial buildings, 2 development lots. Last month, my rental income was $12,800. Last year, my total income was over $300,000. Jessica's laptop slid off her knees as she stared at me in shock. Sarah made a small choking sound, her hand pressed to her throat. Marcus looked like he'd been physically struck. But I wasn't finished. I reached into the portfolio again and pulled out receipts, bank transfers, documentation of every anonymous gift, every mysterious scholarship, every piece of good fortune they'd experienced over the past decade. "Sarah, your student loan reduction? That was me. I created a fake assistance program and paid off $43,000 of your debt." I turned to Jessica. "Your car insurance that's been mysteriously affordable? I've been covering it through an alumni fund that doesn't exist." I looked at Linda, who was still staring at the house deed like it might disappear if she blinked. "Your medical bills from your surgery? The ones that were partially forgiven? That was me. The improvements to this house, the new heating system, the kitchen renovation you thought your generous landlord paid for? All me." Finally, I turned to Marcus, who looked like he wanted to crawl under the furniture. "And the $8,400 for Sarah's engagement ring? The money you told her came from your savings? That was a gift from me." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing I'd ever experienced. Sarah was crying, tears streaming down her face as she looked back and forth between the documents and my face, trying to process what she was hearing. Linda sat frozen, the deed still clutched in her hands. Jessica had gone completely pale, and Marcus looked like he was about to be sick. "Why?" Sarah finally whispered, her voice broken. "Why didn't you tell us?" I sat down on the couch across from them, suddenly feeling every one of my 58 years. "Because you loved the version of me that needed your pity more than you ever loved the version that could actually help you. Because it was easier to let you think I was a failure than to risk finding out that you only wanted me around when I was useful." "That's not true." Linda said, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? I asked. For 10 years, you've all treated me like an embarrassment. Like someone you had to tolerate because we shared blood or history, but not someone you actually respected or valued. You invited me to family dinners and made jokes about my failures. You let Marcus toast to real men while sitting in my house, drinking from glasses I paid for, planning a wedding with money I provided. I stood up and began gathering the documents back into the portfolio. I've been taking care of this family for a decade while being treated like I couldn't take care of myself. I've been the invisible hand making your lives comfortable while you mocked my inability to provide, and I'm done. Dad, please, Sarah sobbed. We didn't know. If you had known, you would have treated me differently, I finished for her. But you shouldn't have needed to know about my bank account to treat me with respect. You shouldn't have needed to see these documents to believe that I was worthy of your love instead of your pity. I closed the portfolio and walked toward the door. Behind me, I could hear Sarah crying harder. Could hear Linda trying to say something about working things out, about family, about misunderstandings. But I was done with explanations and excuses. At the door, I turned back one last time. The house is going on the market next week, I said, my voice calm and final. You have 30 days to find somewhere else to live. The wedding gifts, the scholarship money, the improvements to this place. Consider them my final contributions to this family. Frank, you can't be serious, Linda said, finally finding her voice. This is our home. No, I replied, looking around the living room where I'd played with my daughters as children, where I'd celebrated birthdays and holidays and tried to build a family that would last. This is my house. It always was. You just forgot to check who was really taking care of you. As I walked out the door for the last time, I heard Sarah calling my name, heard Marcus trying to explain something to someone, heard the sound of my family falling apart just like it had 10 years ago. But this time, I was the one choosing to leave. 3 months later, I stood on the deck of my new house, watching the sunrise paint the lake in shades of gold and amber. The property was 2 hours north of the city, 50 acres of woods and water that I'd bought with cash the week after I'd walked out of 123 Maple Street for the last time. It wasn't grand or flashy, just a modest cabin with clean lines and large windows that let in more light than I'd seen in years. The silence was remarkable. No traffic, no neighbors arguing, no phone calls asking for help that came disguised as family obligation. Just the sound of water lapping against the dock and birds calling to each other through the trees. For the first time in a decade, I woke up each morning without the weight of other people's expectations pressing down on my chest. The house on Maple Street had sold within 2 weeks of being listed, exactly as I'd predicted. The buyer was a young couple with twin toddlers who fell in love with the neighborhood and the excellent school district. They'd paid asking price without negotiation, $420,000, which meant I'd made a profit of $140,000 on the property, not counting the 3 years of rental income Linda had unknowingly provided. I'd used part of that money to buy this place, and the rest had gone into expanding my investment portfolio. Turns out, when you stop secretly supporting a family that treats you like a failure, you have a lot more resources available for building your own future. My phone buzzed with a text message, interrupting my morning coffee ritual. It was from Sarah, the 37th message she'd sent since I'd left. I'd stopped reading them after the first week when they'd evolved from desperate apologies to angry accusations to bargaining attempts, but something made me open this one. Dad, Marcus and I called off the engagement. You were right about a lot of things. I'm sorry. Can we talk? I stared at the screen for a long moment, feeling a complex mix of sadness and vindication. I wasn't surprised about the engagement ending. Marcus had been building his identity around being Sarah's provider, her successful husband-to-be, the man who could give her everything her father supposedly couldn't. When that illusion crumbled, when Sarah learned that her father had been the one actually providing for both of them, it would have been impossible for Marcus to maintain his sense of self-worth in the relationship. I typed back a simple response. I'm sorry to hear about Marcus. You deserve someone who values you for who you are, not what you represent to them. Her reply came immediately. Where are you living now? Mom sold the house, but nobody knows where you went. I smiled at that. Linda had probably been furious when she'd realized she had to move out of a house she'd been unknowingly renting from her ex-husband, but she'd managed it. According to the real estate agent, she'd found a small apartment closer to her job at the bank. Jessica had moved back in with her mother temporarily while she finished graduate school. They were all learning to live without the invisible safety net I'd been providing for years. I bought a place up north. I texted back. I'm doing well. Can I visit sometime? I want to explain, to apologize properly. There's so much I want to say. I set the phone down without responding and walked to the edge of the deck. The morning mist was lifting off the lake, revealing a pair of loons floating near the far shore. I'd been watching them for weeks now, learning their patterns, their calls, the way they moved through the water with such effortless grace. The truth was, I missed my daughters. I missed the version of family we could have been if they'd been able to see past their assumptions about success and failure, about what made a man worthy of respect. But I didn't miss the constant ache of being misunderstood, the exhaustion of playing a role that diminished me, the crushing weight of loving people who could only accept a lesser version of who I really was. A few hours later, I was in town picking up supplies when I ran into Tom Bradley, an old co-worker from the automotive plant. He looked exactly the same as he had 10 years ago, maybe a little grayer, still wearing the same style of work clothes and carrying himself with the careful dignity of a man who'd learned to make the most of what life had given him. "Frank Morrison, I'll be damned," he said, grinning as he approached my truck. "Heard you were living up this way now. How you been, buddy?" "Good, Tom. Really good. How about you?" "Can't complain. Still working construction, keeping busy. But look at you." He gestured toward my truck, which was newer than anything I'd driven during my marriage, though still modest compared to what I could afford. "Looks like retirement's treating you well." I realized that Tom was seeing the same thing my family had seen for years, a man of limited means making the best of his situation. But unlike my family, Tom's perception came without judgment or disappointment. He was genuinely happy to see an old friend doing okay, not measuring my worth against some impossible standard of success. "It's been a good change," I said. "Peaceful up here, lots of time to think." "You always were the smart one," Tom said with a laugh. "Rest of us kept grinding away at whatever job would have us, but you always seemed to be thinking 3 steps ahead. Remember how you used to talk about real estate investment during lunch breaks? We all thought you were crazy, but look how that turned out." I almost laughed at the irony. Tom had been paying attention to my dreams and plans in ways that my own family never had. Even when I was just a factory worker talking about possibilities during lunch breaks, he'd seen something in me that Linda and the girls had missed entirely. "Sometimes the crazy ideas are the ones worth following," I said. After Tom left, I drove home thinking about the difference between being known and being understood. My family had known facts about me, had shared history with me, had legal and emotional connections that tied us together. But Tom, who I'd barely spoken to in a decade, had understood something essential about who I was that my own daughters had never grasped. That evening, I called my real estate agent and made an offer on another property, a small apartment building about an hour south of my new home that was being sold by an elderly owner who wanted to retire. It would be my 48th rental property, and the monthly income would cover my living expenses for the rest of my life with money left over to reinvest. As I hung up the phone, I realized that this was what contentment felt like. Not the desperate happiness of finally being recognized or appreciated, but the quiet satisfaction of building something meaningful with your own hands and living on your own terms. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Sarah. "I've been thinking about what you said, about loving the version of you that needed our pity. You were right. I'm ashamed of how we treated you. I want to do better, to be better. Will you give me a chance?" This time I didn't hesitate before responding. "When you're ready to know me as I actually am, instead of who you think I should be, call me. Until then, take care of yourself." I turned off the phone and walked back out to the deck. The loons were still there, moving across the water like they owned the entire lake. They probably did, in all the ways that mattered. They belonged here not because someone had given them permission, but because they'd found a place where they could be exactly what they were without apology or explanation. For 58 years, I'd been trying to earn my place in other people's lives, trying to prove my worth through sacrifice and service and silent generosity. But worth isn't something you earn from others. It's something you claim for yourself. The sun was setting now, turning the water into a mirror that reflected the sky so perfectly it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. Tomorrow, I'd wake up in a house I owned outright, on land that belonged to me, with enough money in the bank to live however I chose for the rest of my life. I'd built this freedom one property at a time, one quiet decision at a time, one day at a time of refusing to accept other people's limitations on who I could become. And if my family ever wanted to be part of this life, they'd have to meet me here, as I actually was. Not as the diminished version of myself I'd been playing for their comfort. The loons called to each other across the water, their voices wild and free and utterly unburdened by anyone else's expectations. I raised my coffee cup in a silent toast to them, to the life I'd built in silence, and to the man I'd finally allowed myself to become. For the first time in 10 years, I slept through the night without dreaming about being someone else. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.